So now I have the pleasure to announce a speaker who I already have listened to before and whose speech impressed me so much that I really now and then are thinking of his words and his speech. So I'm very happy that we have Indy Johar at our Cross-Innovation Conference here today. Indy Johar is actually an architect, but if you listen to him, you realize he's so much more than that. He's a real cross-innovation person and therefore the perfect speaker for this conference. And there he already is. Hello, Indy. We're very happy to have you here today. So the floor or the screen is yours.
I'm super, super delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I suppose in the spirit of this conversation, I'm going to take this morning to sort of set a bit of a context of why I think cross-innovation is critical. And I think actually we're in an age of polymaths, an age of being able to hybridize knowledge across multiple disciplines, which is fundamental to how we as a society move forward. So I'm honored to be here, firstly, and then secondly, thank you for holding these sort of conversations. I think it's such an important moment that we start to think about this future. So it is in this context that I won't spend too much time. As kind of a little bit of my history, I've been part of building sort of a whole bunch of organizations, all the way from OpenDesk, open source furniture company, to WikiHouse, open source housing, to Architecture 00, to multiple impact hubs, and also most recently DarkMatter Labs. But you can see all that stuff online, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. What I really want to focus on is the moment. And I'm sorry if I'm going to take the tone down a little bit, because I think there's an important moment that we're facing in history, and why I think what you guys are proposing and what many people are doing is really critical. I think it's worth considering where we are right now as a civilization and the scale of the kind of transformation and transition that we're facing. Obviously, I don't think it's been mentioned, certainly in the review, but if you look at the kind of COVID situation, whether the huge amount of people that have passed away, people that have been long-term affected, but if you compact that with the scale of the economic transition, so the UK is facing the worst recession in 300 years, to the scale of social progress losses. So actually, our real poverty increasing for the first time in a generation. It is in this context that we need to recognize the future. And we need to recognize that COVID has in many ways revealed the fragility of an existing system, a system which is actually problematic, which is accelerating injustices. It has also revealed a new type of relationship is required between state, market, civil society in a way that wasn't really clear. And it's revealed and made apparent our global interdependencies. The global vaccine search that we've seen has involved massive amounts of innovation across the world to be able to drive that. And then if you marry that, I think it has also triggered cascading risks throughout society. And that triggering of cascading risks is really critical. But perhaps more critically, I would say, is the period we're entering for the next 10 years, at least, is a herald of an age of long emergencies, where COVID is just the beginning of a actually much more structured transition. And if you talk about decarbonization of the planet in terms of actually the amount of pollutions we're producing, or the plastics or biodiversity losses, I think we're at a cascading series of risks. And that requires new capabilities. And these cascading risks are visible even just in COVID. You see how the impacts of actually COVID have transformed and are transforming our cities, are transforming how we live, how we operate. But it is part of a bigger issue. Nutrition decline is significant. We've got entrenched inequality, diversity losses in terms of actually a whole bunch of diversity losses are happening. Labor market automation. So we're seeing probably the largest labor market transition that we've seen from the last industrial revolution already in play. Species extinction, voter disfranchisement. So the microviolence of our environment pollutions. These are systemic failures. And so one thing I would say is that what becomes clear is that climate change and CO2 is a symptom, or CO2 kind of release and greenhouse gases, GSGs, are a symptom of a much more systemic failure. They're a symptom, they're not the cause. And the systemic failure requires a different type of innovation theory. It requires us to recognize that there's a different architecture of manifestation. Cause and effects are delayed and displaced. So where the causes are and where the effects are not linear. The impact of this crisis is cascading. And there's no single simplistic villain or hero. And it is in here that we start to see that if we want to make a change on these large crises, this requires innovation across systems, across people and multiple actors. And building that capability to innovate across the system becomes fundamental. And many of the wicked problems, whether it's housing and the cost of housing in many parts, it becomes very clear housing shortfalls, which we are seeing in many places, it becomes clear this is not a problem of just making more housing, but it's linked into our banking system, linked into our mortgage system, a whole bunch of issues that are linked in from that perspective. Or whether we look at even obesity, you start to see the complexity of the multiple factors that are driving it. And these are not just about sugar tax or any of these things. So the nature of these problems requires a fundamentally different innovation capacity and theory. In space, but also in time. And what? So I think when we talk about actually how we innovate, we also have to recognize the risk not only that we are facing in terms of actually the crises that are lining up in front of us, but the risks we are generating for future generations. So future generations, there are billions of people that in the next 50,000 years will live on the earth, many billions, right? Actually, we're introducing risks and reducing the possibilities of future generations in terms of what we're doing. Are we really being good ancestors for that future? So when we talk about this innovation capacity, it is about understanding, yes, our innovation impacts horizontally in space, but also considerably in time in that thesis. And that requires a different type of modality. It requires a modality to be able to build innovation, which is not about a single magic bullet, but actually a whole portfolio of interventions that work together to drive change in a different format. And the thesis is that this cannot be done centrally, but you have to build the capability of a whole system to be able to innovate in smart ways. And portfolios that span all the way from actually individual interactions to policy regulatory innovations. This sort of spread, this portfolio of interventions, has to work through a declaration of interdependence. Recognizing these things have to work together in relationship to each other. And recognizing that actually this is poor housing, so housing of poor quality introduces liabilities and costs to a healthcare service. So this is not about innovating just in housing for the sake of housing, recognizing these are systems with interdependency. Same is true with actually poor urban areas and the costs they generate in terms of, and the lives lost as a result of penal systems. This is $1 million blocks in Chicago and other places, looking at how urban blight was actually generating a huge cost of government in terms of sort of penal systems and jails and the cost of jails and other environments. So we have to realize that actually most innovation works. You might invest in one location, but actually the innovation typically spells out. It spills over into that reality. And this is some stuff that we were doing around the High Line in New York with some really good friends of ours, Maxim and various others. What you start to realize is that when you look at the High Line, which many of you will know in New York, if you calculated the land value uplift attributable to the High Line, so the value of the land went up massively as a result of the High Line. If you just took 10% of the relationship, the value uplift, you would have paid for the High Line in 10 months. So here what we start to understand is, and civic asset creates these spillover values, this innovation value that spills over and is largely captured by private systems. How do we start to organize that? How do we build new types of relationships which recognize those civic values? And how do we construct new models? So we're doing work around smart governance, which allow us to be able to understand this stuff, but also understand the value, the spillover value innovations generate into this cross. The same is true for lots of other things. So a tree A tree for most local authorities is a liability. Its maintenance costs and its insurance costs are the costs that are on the books. But actually, all the other impacts in terms of reduced heat island effect, sustainable urban drainage, reduced noise level effects, decreased crime levels, mental health improvement, improved air quality, these are all discounted. We tend to focus just on the costs, and our accounting system is actually focusing on just these costs. But all the value, all the benefits are ignored. So our current accounting system doesn't take care of this system of values that actually these trees and our forests and forests create. So if we're going to drive rich systems which create spillover value, we have to build an accounting system that is able to think about that. We have to understand that actually the kind of future liabilities we're generating and the everyday effects, whether it's soil degradation, heat island effects, chronic illnesses, many of these things, like for example, schizophrenia is twice as high in urban environments than rural environments. This is a function of some deep issues. How do we start to innovate, which looks deep into the system, deep into the actually accounting infrastructures, the rights and ownership models that actually set up these models, that set up this infrastructure? So how do we start to think about that becomes critical. So one of the things I'd like to bring to this thesis is that if we are really going to build the innovation capacity that it goes across pathways and across systems, we have to also engineer a new thesis of bureaucracy, a new thesis of governance, financing, accounting, and social norms of how we see ourselves. And that applies to many things, like the kind of natural assets economy. As I've said, we are going to see places like Madrid, Milan are looking to plant millions of trees to actually build urban forests to deal with some of the climate change mitigation effects. But if we only understand trees from the single point benefit of CO2, we will create new ghettos of isolation between ourselves and these assets. So if we're going to look for the integrated cross value of these things, we have to start to imagine different futures. And it's worth us recognizing the scale of the conversation that we're facing. And this applies to this. Over the next 10 years, we're going to see trillions of euros spent into the renewal of our cities and places. Nature-based solutions, the retrofit of our cities, the reimagination of our social infrastructure, the reimagination of actually human development. Whole value chains are going to be just innovated. And these need to be thought through, not from the single point value of what they are, but the spillover value they create from society. If we're going to genuinely build infrastructure which has value across the system, we need to imagine how you finance these sort of transformations, not from short theses, but from 100-year theses. We're looking at stuff like smart perpetual bonds. We need to look at actually new governance accords. How do we govern in this reality? Is there such a thing as public and private in a systems interdependent world? In a world of interdependence, is there such a thing as private? Or are we talking about off-state but for public interest organizations? In a declaration of interdependence, what is our new governance thesis? Because cross-value and cross-innovation is going to require us to build a new type of governance thesis that sits behind it. And it also requires us to be able to actually think about the liabilities that we generate and the spillover of liabilities, but also the spillover of future value. How do we start to engage that? How do we use smart contracting capability to create whole new classes of business models like we're doing with smart governance, which are many to many business models which construct a fundamentally different way of operating? And is it really funds or is it much more structural? And is it new markets, new infrastructures that are required? New ways of thinking about these issues, whether it's financial infrastructure, governance infrastructure, organizational infrastructure. So I'm coming to an end, but I want to end on some key issues. I think what I've spoken about here is important, but I would say that this is just a symptom or a first horizon issue of what I think is a much bigger translation. Over the next, I think, 10, 20 years, we're at the beginning of a fundamental transformation in our relationship to the world. And I would argue the last 400 years have been about a relationship with the world, where humans have detached themselves from nature and the world, have created dominion with the world, and are in control of the world. Our thesis of relationship to the world has been about control and exploitation. And I can go back in history and say it was good or bad, but the reality is it's got us to this moment. It has allowed civilization to grow to this moment. I think we're now at a paradigm shift. Our relationship to the world has fundamentally been questioned by science, philosophy, and actually technology. So it is increasingly apparent that if you look at a quantum physics level, there's a sort of entanglement, a deep entanglement. And the order that we see in front of us is just an implicate order. But the real issue is the great entanglement that sits behind us. We know that even as humans, actually we're a multitude of organisms massively driven by a contextual relationship. The idea of generational ships that will go for 2 generations into space become very difficult. So as we start to think about this, it becomes clear that there's a much more structural transformation. So, and I suppose what I want to say is that there are at least 4 critical missions for us to move into the future. They're about foundational transformations in our relationship with nature, where we are not in control of nature, but we are in treaty with nature. It's clear that in our thesis of our relationship with each other and ourselves, we have to recognize that we're not individuals, but a multitude of organisms. Humans are a multitude of organisms. More than 50% of you is not even human DNA. We are in symbiotic relationship with huge amounts of other organisms that make us who we are. That consciousness actually is a key aspect of recognizing our interdependence with the world, but simultaneously recognizing a new relationship with each other. At the same time, we have to recognize there's a new desire for human development. What I found fascinating is that how do we start to build a new thesis of human development fit for an age of automation, where actually we are talking about unlocking the care, the creativity, the contextual intelligence, all of these capacities of human development. At the same time, we need a new relationship with the future, one which is not about colonizing the future with fixed income returns, but actually a new foundational capacity. And here is where I start to say that if we're going to think about the future, I think we have to put at the center of this conversation of innovation our idea of reimagining our relationship with nature, the things that we make, humans, and the future. And that requires us to reimagine the lock-ins. So much of the world that we see around us, much of the perceptions that we have built around us, are locked into cultural language as well as institutional narratives. Property ownership is a thesis, is an idea of the world in terms of actually there are other ideas of the world. We have to think about new ways of organizing, which aren't about control, but actually about emboldened relationships with people. An employment contract is a last vestige of control, where you lose your free speech in exchange for money. So how do we build a new type of capacity to collaborate in a deep sense? How do we build the capacity, the deep code innovation, and all the structural aspects that I talked about? So I think as we head into the next 10 years, yes, we will see big investments over the next few, large-scale transformations. But these transformations have to sit on the basis of understanding this spillover value, this interdependent value. And that has to sit on the basis of a new relationship with the world. And that requires a new age of polymaths. Polymaths that can actually think across disciplines, innovate across disciplines. The people that heralded this age, Newton and many others, were actually cross-disciplinary actors. They were operating between science, arts, philosophy, many other things. And actually our institutions have increasingly become siloed. So one of the key things for me is how do we build the polymathic capacity of European society as a whole to start to innovate in a rich way. And this is why I really welcome the cross-innovation capacities that you've been building and are building, because I think it's fundamental to the transformation that's required and is necessary. And I think it will be fundamental to the way forward. So with that, I think we need to just I think it's really important we look forward, and we look forward not with fear of how much of the pie that we have, or how we will divide the earth between ourselves, but actually look forward with the infinite possibility of what's possible with human imagination and creativity. And I think that, for me, is super critical. With that, I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Indy, and your applause. That was very inspiring, and of course, we are glad that you are supporting our activities as well with your speech. And we have some questions from the chat already. So one is, what are the key hurdles you experience towards such circular thinking and shaping? What would you say?
So I think the key hurdles are that our institutions are designed to think individually. So the health department thinks through health, and the housing department thinks through housing, or the natural assets department thinks through natural assets. So building the institutional horizontal capacity, the horizontal capacity of governments, agencies, institutions to think is difficult. Second thing I think has really been challenging is building teams which are able to operate across finance, data science, coding, ethnography, ethics, and building that horizontal capacity to be able to do some of the work that's necessary is really critical. Third thing is context. One of the reasons we're, as a team, we're 40 people, which with teams in South Korea, Amsterdam, which was where we're headquartered, but also all the way through to Montreal, is because every context has actually very rich particularity. So we're doing amazing, really interesting work with people in Canada around the future of governance, hybridizing indigenous governance models with new technologies. At the same time, we're doing some really amazing work in South Korea, which is looking at the role of civic AI, a new type of machine learning capabilities, which actually build humans into the loop of human participation. So I think cross-innovation requires actually multiple contexts for us to learn from, but also it requires new types of relationships of the people we partner with. And that really is a challenge. The final challenge, I think, is language. So I think you have to build hybrid languages. And in the nuance of that, that's actually about language is not just about communication, it's about our ability to paint the world together. So one of the big things we often do is how do you build shared worldviews, shared ways of comprehending each other's language to be able to do that. And that requires time and significant time building those relationships to do that. So most of this work is based on quite high levels of trust.
Yeah, thank you very much. We of course totally agree with you that we need this fundamental shift in innovation systems, and we need to innovate together. But for me, still the question is a little bit how. For example, yesterday I was in one of our network sessions here at the conference with a company which is producing material for the huge car companies here in Germany. And they are, of course, also aware about that now the whole mobility shift is coming, and then that we need to take another more sustainable way now, and going to produce cars in the soon future in a different way. And they then, of course, also have to innovate. But for them, the question was, how? How do I reach out now? How do I get out of my context into a wider context, into a larger innovating systems where I can not maybe only with a different company, that would be the first step, but maybe also with the public sector and so on, because mobility shift is not something which you can do with one company, just as an example.
Yeah, I know, it's such a great example. Thank you so much. I think this is where the role of institutions becomes really important. And I think, if I remember correctly, Germany created many of these fantastic institutions around looking at industry-wide innovation capacities and whole value chain type capacities. And I think I think Germany was the first one to create them in the 19th century. You recognize the reality that innovation is not a single corporate game, it's a whole systems game. So I think there is some meta structures that are required, meta institutions required to be able to support that. Also recognizing that, for example, we're doing a lot of work around circular economies. It's also really interesting to recognize what the role of as we move from product selling to being service selling. So when you're supplying services as opposed to products, and that I mean that literally, that you can provide the envelope of a building as a service as opposed to a product, you start to have a different type of responsibility to the material economy. So I think there's some structural stuff, there's new institutional relationships, new responsibilities. So if I'm owning the envelope, whilst I'm putting the envelope on your building, but I'm still owning it, I have a responsibility to maintain it, to look after it, to do the circular management of its material cases. So I think there's going to be structural governance questions, capacities around whole supply chain to be able to do that. And I think this is where, we are strongly talking about whole supply chain investment theses, which are going to be critical to be able to do that. And then how do you create the open source capabilities, the protocols, the standards to be able to do that with radical interoperability, with digital provenance capabilities. So I think we're talking about foundationally a new type of economy between a systems economy and an individual economy. But it's such a great question. I wish I could go on about it for hours.
We could go on as well, but we have some other questions to address. So one is, are we going to need a subject-specific education, or will cross-subject education be the primary type of education?
Yeah, my intuition is slightly different. I think we should go deep. So I think there's a way to look at the world, which is you can see the whole world through a grain of sand. But the question is that, so there were quite a lot, it was a whole generation ago, there was lots of physicists that ended up doing maths, and mathematicians that ended up doing physics, and then doing engineering to computing. I think we have to create the institutional capacity for people to be able to move between and across disciplines. So going deep is not just going deep, it's going deep to understand breadth. So at a certain moment, you start to actually bridge into disciplines. And I think one of the challenges are that our knowledge infrastructures are, if you go to a university and you're a senior professor, and you step out of, if you're a physics department, you start doing maths or chemistry problems, upstream or downstream problems. Upstream would be maths, downstream would be chemistry. You start to create fundamental questions about your credibility is questioned, you're not able to drive it, you don't get the support. So the question for me is about how do we institutionally encourage people to go deep and then to move across fields as well. And that's where innovation occurs. And that's an institutional thesis of how we value polymaths. And there's a whole history in the last 30 years, polymathic capability has just not been valued. Now there's a whole series of books and people coming up, neo-generalists and other people talking about this stuff. But I think we have to institutionally build the capacity to grow polymathic thinking. So, and I don't think polymathic thinking comes through generalism. It comes through going deep on an issue and then being able to bridge across it. And you've had amazing musicians actually on this channel. And it's about your relationship to be able to go through the musicians, to be able to talk about hearing, to understand social neuroscience. It's the leaps, it's the pass forwards in knowledge which are critical.
Yes, thank you very much. We try to institutionalize it a little bit here in Hamburg. So, of course, on a small scale, if you're thinking in a global context. But if we're here on a European conference, and I think there are a lot of public authorities out there which hopefully also would like to institutionalize this kind of thinking and acting with cross-innovation in the future. But still, you also addressed this long-term thinking which is needed to act in a sustainable cross-innovation way. And that also is such a difficult question. How we need a total system shift. I mean, there have been societies, there are maybe still some societies which are thinking in the long term, but our society here and now, it seems very short-term thinking sometimes. And how do we get the sustainable approach? How do we start to think in long terms again?
So it's thank you for, again, such a great question. So I would suggest several things here. So I think long-term thinking is in the hands of the few. I think one of the big questions we should be talking about is how do we build democratized long-term thinking? So, and democratizing long-term thinking is a situational challenge, as in, if you put people into economically precarious situations, if you make them economically vulnerable with low levels of savings, what you create is effectively a vulnerability which encourages people to buy and operate in the short term. So their consumption patterns change to short-term consumption patterns focused on psychological well-being. We know this. Large-scale recessions in economies drive a particular type of consumption. Chocolate goes up, fast fashion goes up, going to the hairdresser goes up. Long-term thinking disappears. And it's the same for households. You put a household under financial stress, it operates this way. So one of the big questions that I think we have as a society is that as a result of the short-termism and the precariousness in our labor markets and what we built, and Germany's rather exceptional in this, but I think many other places, even across Europe, we've built a precariousness in society, which then builds a malconsumption economy. So what we're consuming is not what we need to improve our lives, we're consuming to fix the holes in our vulnerabilities. And that creates a thesis of actually short-termism is we're not even thinking. Societies, as a democratic society, we're not even be able to build mandates to think long-term because the psychological response mechanisms are that way. And we've designed then all our feedback mechanisms. So the idea of capturing opinion. We know opinion is a very short-term, emotionally driven response, where actually deliberation builds a completely different response. So if I ask people if they like UBI on an open channel off the street, I'll typically get about 70% people saying they don't like it. But if I invite people to be part of a deliberation for a day to think about UBI and look at and talk about it together, you get a 70% response positive. And the reason is you've changed the decision-making model of that, because in the act of the deliberation, you create fundamentally a de-othering of our relationship with society. So in order to build the spaces to allow for long-termism and long-term thinking, we have to start to change some of the structures. And that also requires us to think about long-termism from a fundamentally different perspective. So this is not about long-term planning, but it's about building the capacities to do that. And local authorities not only need to do that, but also build some of the horizontal capacities that I was talking about earlier. But yeah, I think it's a really critical question for us in European societies. How do we build long-term capacity? And it's really critical because in a way, and I don't mean to put this into contrast, but if you look at Eastern societies which are looking at 50-year cycles, whether it's China, Singapore, it's increasingly clear that Western economies don't have the mechanisms and the institutional structures to think long-term. And that's a real strategic deficit because we're not able to see and look at 50-year organizational moves. We're actually operating on 3 to 5 year cycles at best. And that makes us tactical in a world which is increasingly becoming strategic. And how do we build these new types of institutions democratically? And this is really key. Long-termism mustn't become a thesis of colonization of the future. But how do we as democracies operationalize into long-termism, I think is a really, really key issue. And this is work that we are doing with Climate Kick as an institution around this issue of long-termism as a fundamental issue.
Maybe a question that's regarding that topic on a more personal level, going deep and approaching innovation systematically, how do you personally tackle frustration that somehow must go hand in hand with your circular efforts and visionary addressing social innovation?
I really don't get frustrated. I think everyone does things that are real and rational to their context, right? Rationality isn't about my rationality. There's an expanded thesis of rationality, which recognizes that actually it is rational for someone who's been in an argument to respond in the way that they do, which might be even self-defeating. So I suppose my first place is to start with great empathy, that people aren't trying, 99% of people are trying to do the best thing in the context that they are. So I think it starts with empathy. The second thing, I suppose, for us is that we don't start to try to move the middle. I mean, we write blogs, you can read all of our work, we write some of the challenges that we have with collaboration and how we do collaboration. We just wrote a manual, or we looked at how do we operate as an organization and published it. But what we realized is that it's really critical that we become much more clear about what we do, but also we build the capacity to operate. We publish everything. People come to us because they want to do it. We're not trying to do RFPs and force people to do stuff they don't want to do. They come to us. We work with them as partners, not as consultants. We work with them as partners, and we open source the knowledge. And the reason that we do that is that what we're trying to create is pathways and ladders for others to follow. And I think for me, the key thing here is making things happen. And as you make things happen, actually other people will see evidence and follow. So I firstly start with great empathy, because everyone's situation is real. The second thing is start with people where they are and actually build from there. And most people intuitively recognize this stuff. So the real challenges are the institutions, the KPIs that surround them, the performance indicators for their jobs, the contracts to which they're working. And it is starting with empathy for that reality that you can construct new types of dialogue and pathways forward.
Thank you very much, Indy Johar. I think all of you who listened now to him understand why his words from his last speech stayed in my head for such a long time. We're going to take your words with us. Thank you very much for being here today, Indy Johar.